The morning air hung heavy over Bingham, Massachusetts, a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forest that seemed to watch the residents with ancient, patient eyes. Eleanor Davis adjusted her cleaning cart outside room 212 of the Bingham Inn, a Victorian-era hotel that had stood on Main Street since 1887. At 47, Eleanor had spent 23 years as head of housekeeping, knowing every creaking floorboard and stubborn stain in the building. "New girl starts today," Marjorie, her 60-year-old colleague, reminded her as she pushed her own cart toward room 214. Some college dropout from Boston, named Zoe something. Eleanor nodded, fishing the master key from her uniform pocket. November had arrived with bitter winds and early darkness, tourist season long over. Only business travelers and the occasional lost soul seeking small-town charm occupied the 12 rooms of the inn during these months. As she unlocked room 212, Eleanor's skin prickled. Mr. Harrington, a pharmaceutical representative from Chicago, had checked out earlier, leaving behind the usual mess of rumpled sheets and damp towels. But something felt different today. The air inside was unnaturally cold, despite the ancient radiator clanking in the corner. Eleanor pushed her cart inside, flicking on lights to dispel the gloom. The room appeared normal at first glance: king-size bed, antique writing desk, paisley wallpaper, faded from decades of sunlight. As she stripped the bed, her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the pillow. Pulling it out, she found a small porcelain doll, no larger than her hand, with painted red lips and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow her movements. "Where did you come from?" she murmured, turning the doll over. Its dress was handmade, delicate stitches forming an old-fashioned pinafore. Eleanor set it on the nightstand, making a mental note to place it in the lost and found. As she bent to retrieve a sock from under the bed, she heard it, a whisper so faint she thought it was the wind seeping through the window frame. But when she straightened, the whisper came again, clearer this time. Words she couldn't quite make out, spoken in reverse. Eleanor turned toward the nightstand. The doll sat motionless, its painted smile eerily wide. The whispers had stopped. "Getting old," she muttered to herself, returning to her work. But as she cleaned the bathroom, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A knock at the door made her jump. "Mrs. Davis?" A young woman with dyed blue hair and multiple ear piercings stood in the doorway. "I'm Zoe Campbell. Mr. Peterson said to report to you for training." Eleanor composed herself, pushing thoughts of the doll aside. "Come in, Zoe. You can start by learning how we make the beds here. Hospital corners always," as she demonstrated the proper technique. Eleanor noticed Zoe's gaze drifting to the nightstand. "Is that part of the room decor?" Zoe asked, pointing to the doll. "No. A guest must have left it." Eleanor picked it up, intending to place it in her cart's lost and found compartment. The moment her fingers touched the porcelain, the doll's head rotated just slightly, just enough that both women froze in place. "Did you see?" Zoe began. "It's an old doll," Eleanor cut her off. "Sometimes they have loose parts." She quickly wrapped it in a hand towel and placed it in her cart, ignoring the goosebumps rising on her arms. Later that evening, Eleanor would discover 3 more dolls in different rooms of the Bingham Inn, and each one, when found, would whisper prayers backwards in the voice of a child. Zoe Campbell had taken the housekeeping job at the Bingham Inn out of desperation. 2 semesters short of her psychology degree, financial reality had forced her back to her hometown, a place she'd sworn to escape. The inn wasn't her first choice, but jobs were scarce in Bingham, population 4,213 and shrinking every year. Her first day had been unremarkable until the incident with the doll in room 212. She'd seen it move, she was certain of it. But Eleanor's dismissive explanation made her doubt herself. "You'll take the 3rd floor today," Eleanor informed her on her second morning, handing her a ring of keys. "Rooms 301 through 306, all checkouts except 303, which is staying another night." The 3rd floor was quieter than the 2nd, the hallway narrower with slanted ceilings betraying the building's age. Zoe started with room 301, a smaller room with twin beds typically reserved for budget travelers. The room was relatively clean, the occupant having left only that morning. As Zoe replaced the sheets, she noticed something scratched into the wooden headboard. "They come at 3:33. The carving looked fresh, the wood still pale where it had been cut. "Vandalism on my second day." "Great." Zoe made a note to report it to Eleanor, though she doubted the aging wood could be repaired. In room 302, Zoe found another doll. This one was hidden in the closet, propped up against the wall. Unlike the one from yesterday, this doll was made of cloth with button eyes and yarn hair. It wore a miniature version of the Bingham Inn housekeeping uniform. Zoe's hand trembled as she picked it up. A small paper tag was attached to its arm with a safety pin. In childish handwriting it read, "Zoe will help us. She dropped the doll, backing away. How could it have her name? She'd only started yesterday and no one knew she'd be assigned to this room. Her back hit something solid, the full-length mirror mounted on the bathroom door. Zoe spun around, heart racing, and found herself staring at her reflection. Except for just a moment, it wasn't quite right. The reflection's eyes seemed darker, its smile a fraction too wide. Zoe blinked and her normal reflection stared back, pale and frightened. The walkie-talkie at her hip crackled. "Zoe, how's it going up there?" Eleanor's voice was tinny through the small speaker. Zoe grabbed it with shaking hands. "I found another doll. This one. It has my name on it." A long pause followed before Eleanor responded. "Bring it down to the office when you're done, but just finish your room, Zoe. We'll talk later." By the time Zoe reached room 305, her nerves were frayed. She'd found nothing unusual in rooms 303 and 304, but the sense of being observed had intensified. The scratching sounds in the walls she'd initially attributed to the old building now seemed to follow her from room to room. Room 305 was in disarray. The guest had left without folding anything, clothes strewn across the floor, wet towels in a heap by the bathtub. As Zoe gathered the towels, she noticed writing on the bathroom mirror, visible only because of the steam still lingering from a recent shower. "Don't listen to their prayers." Zoe stood frozen, the words seeming to pulse on the glass surface. As she watched, condensation formed new words beneath the first message. "They're coming for you next." The towels dropped from her hands as she backed out of the bathroom. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath suddenly visible in the air. And then, from somewhere nearby, she heard it. The whispered prayers, backwards and distorted, in the voice of a child. Eleanor Davis sat alone in the employee break room, staring at the collection of dolls arranged on the table before her. 5 now, each discovered in different rooms over the past 2 days. The porcelain one from room 212. The cloth doll with Zoe's name. A wooden marionette from room 106, its strings tangled as if recently manipulated. A cornhusk doll traditional to the region, found stuffed into an air vent in room 204. And the newest addition, a modern plastic doll with blinking electronic eyes that shouldn't have been able to function without batteries. "Eleanor, we need to talk about this." Thomas Peterson, the 70-year-old owner of the Bingham Inn, stood in the doorway. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, his bow tie askew. 5 dolls in 2 days, Tom, all left behind by different guests. Eleanor pushed a strand of gray hair behind her ear, and they all do things. Thomas closed the door and took a seat across from her. "You know what this reminds me of?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "November 1998, and November 1973, before that. According to my father's journals, Thomas picked up the porcelain doll, examining it with narrowed eyes. Every 25 years like clockwork. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the small window of the break room. The ancient heating system groaned to life, pipes knocking in the walls. "We should close the inn," Eleanor said firmly. "Send the current guests away with refunds. Shut down until December." Thomas set the doll down with a sigh. "You know, we can't afford that, Ellie. The bank's already threatening foreclosure. If we close now, even for a few weeks, ... is money worth what happened to Rebecca?" Eleanor's voice hardened. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. Rebecca Chun, a housekeeper during the 1998 incident, had been found in room 212, unresponsive and muttering backwards prayers. She'd never recovered, spending the last 25 years in Lakeside Psychiatric Facility on the outskirts of town. "We'll take precautions," Thomas finally said. "No one works alone. No night shifts. And we'll call Pastor Michael to bless the rooms. That didn't work last time. We have to try something." And Ellie ... quotes Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping. "We need to know if Zoe's involved. She's just a girl who arrived in town exactly 1 week before, November 15th. A girl those dolls seemed particularly interested in." Eleanor wanted to defend Zoe, but doubt had taken root. The young woman's arrival had coincided perfectly with the appearance of the dolls. And there was something about her, a sensitivity perhaps, or a vulnerability that set her apart. The break room door swung open and Zoe stood there, her face ashen. "Room 305, she gasped. "You need to see this." The 3 of them hurried upstairs, Eleanor and Thomas struggling to keep up with Zoe's youthful pace. Room 305 had been cleaned earlier that day and was unoccupied, awaiting new guests. Zoe pushed the door open, revealing a sight that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Dozens of dolls sat arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room. Dolls of every description, porcelain, plastic, cloth, wood, all facing inward as if in silent conference. In the center of the circle lay a new doll, larger than the others, with a face meticulously crafted to resemble Zoe. "I didn't do this," Zoe whispered, her voice breaking. "I locked this room after cleaning it. I swear. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, reaching for the doll with Zoe's face. The moment his fingers touched it, every doll in the circle turned its head in perfect unison to stare at the three humans. And then the whispers began, dozens of childlike voices speaking backwards prayers that made the air itself seem to vibrate with malevolence. Dr. Amelia Winters had not expected to return to Bingham. After completing her doctorate in parapsychology at Miskatonic University in nearby Arkham, she'd built a respectable career debunking hauntings across New England. But the urgent call from Thomas Peterson, an old family friend, had drawn her back to the town she'd left 15 years earlier. The dolls are just the beginning, Thomas explained as he led her through the Bingham Inn's lobby. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. It's escalating faster than in previous cycles. Amelia adjusted her glasses, taking in the Victorian charm of the inn that had featured prominently in her childhood memories. And you're certain this follows the same pattern as the 1973 and 1998 incidents? Identical except for the timeline. It's accelerated. Thomas lowered his voice as they passed the front desk where a nervous-looking young man checked in a rain-soaked couple. It started with the dolls, then the whispers. This morning, 3 guests reported seeing their reflections moving independently. They climbed the creaking staircase to the 3rd floor where Eleanor and Zoe waited outside room 305. Amelia noted the protective symbols hastily drawn in chalk around the doorframe, Christian crosses interspersed with older, pagan sigils she recognized from her studies. Dr. Winters, Eleanor greeted her with visible relief. "Thank you for coming. The dolls are still inside," Zoe added, keeping her distance from the door. "They haven't moved since yesterday, but the whispering continues." Amelia removed equipment from her bag, an EMF detector, a digital thermometer, and a modified audio recorder designed to capture electronic voice phenomena. "I'll need to go in alone first." Basic protocol. The other stepped back as she approached the door. Before entering, she turned to Zoe. "You found the first doll with your name. Have you experienced anything else personally directed at you?" Zoe hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. "The messages on the mirror were addressed to me. And I've been having dreams. Children calling my name from the woods behind the inn, asking me to help them dig." Amelia made a mental note of this detail. "Interesting. The connection to the land itself suggests this may be more than a standard haunting." Inside room 305, the circle of dolls remained undisturbed. Amelia's instruments immediately registered anomalies, temperatures 20 degrees below the rest of the building, electromagnetic fluctuations that made her detector squeal in protest. She set up her audio recorder and addressed the dolls directly. "If there is an intelligence present, I invite you to communicate." The response was immediate and chilling. Every doll tilted its head upward in unison, and a cacophony of whispers filled the room. Amelia's recorder captured the sounds, the digital display showing massive audio spikes. When played backwards later, the whispers would resolve into a single phrase, repeated dozens of times. The door opens when the blood is offered. Amelia completed her initial assessment and rejoined the others in the hallway, her scientific detachment slightly shaken. "This is not a standard haunting or poltergeist activity," she informed them. "The phenomena are too coordinated, too purposeful." "And then what is it?" Thomas pressed. "I believe we're dealing with a summoning ritual, one that's been attempted every 25 years. Amelia referenced her notes. "November 15th seems to be significant. That's when the 1973 and 1998 incidents reached their peak, correct?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "Rebecca was found on the morning of the 15th. That's 3 days from now," Zoe realized, her face paling. "We need to understand what's being summoned and why it's focused on this location." Amelia turned to Thomas. "Is there a historical society in town somewhere with records predating the inn?" "The library has archives going back to the town's founding in 1796, he confirmed. "Then that's where we start." Amelia checked her watch. 3:15 p.m. "We need to work quickly. Based on the acceleration pattern, I'd estimate we have less than 72 hours before whatever is coming fully manifests." As they headed downstairs, none of them noticed the small porcelain doll watching from the shadows at the end of the hallway. Nor did they hear it when it whispered, "Too late. She's already here." The Bingham Public Library was housed in a Greek Revival building at the end of Main Street, its white columns stark against the darkening afternoon sky. Inside, the scent of old paper and wood polish permeated the air. Marion Blackwood, the 80-year-old librarian, greeted them with suspicious eyes. "Town archives are closed for digitization," she announced before Thomas could explain their presence. "Marion, this is important," Thomas pleaded. "We need information about the land where the inn stands. It's happening again, isn't it?" Marion's expression softened slightly. "Like it did when I was a girl, and then again when my hair started graying." Amelia stepped forward. You witnessed the previous occurrences? Marian glanced around the empty library before gesturing for them to follow her to a locked door marked Historical Archives, Staff Only. Inside, floor-to-ceiling shelves held leather-bound ledgers, yellowing newspapers, and acid-free boxes containing fragile documents. I was 13 in 1973, Marian explained as she unlocked a cabinet. My father was deputy sheriff. He was called to the inn, the Bingham house back then, when the maid found Mr. Walsh hanging from the rafters in room 305. Suicide? Amelia asked, taking notes. Marian shook her head. That's what the official report said. But my father told me Mr. Walsh's eyes had been gouged out and he'd carved symbols into his own chest. Before he died, he'd collected every doll from the local children and arranged them in a circle. She retrieved a brittle newspaper clipping dated November 16, 1973. The headline read, "Local man dies in tragic incident at Bingham House." And 1998? Thomas prompted. Rebecca Chun, Marian's voice softened. Such a sweet girl. She wasn't from Bingham originally, came from Boston looking for work. Just like ... double quotes, her eyes drifted to Zoe. Just like me, Zoe finished, a chill running down her spine. Marian nodded gravely. She started finding the dolls, too. By November 14th, she was speaking backwards. They found her the next morning trying to claw her way through the floor of room 305 with her bare hands. Her fingernails were completely gone, the wood stained with her blood. Eleanor made a small noise of distress. She never recovered. Still at Lakeside, still trying to dig through floors when the orderlies aren't watching. But what about before 1973? Amelia pressed. You said the cycle is every 25 years. That would mean 1948, 1923, 1898, ... Marian moved to another section, pulling out a heavy leather-bound book. Town records from 1898. There was a boarding house on that land before the inn was built. She flipped through the pages, stopping at an entry from November. Here. Fire claims Widow Tanner's boarding house. 7 lost to the flames. The article mentions dolls found arranged around the bodies. And before that? Amelia urged. Marian's research led them through a grim historical pattern. In 1873, a family home had stood on the property. All 6 family members died of mysterious causes on November 15th. In 1848, a doctor's residence and practice had occupied the land. He and 3 patients were found deceased, surrounded by children's toys. The pattern continued back to 1798, 2 years after Bingham's founding. What happened in 1798? Zoe asked, her voice barely audible. Marian pulled out the oldest volume, its pages so fragile they threatened to crumble at her touch. The original settlement journals. She carefully turned to an entry dated November 15, 1798. Minister Elijah Bingham reports, "Today we have laid to rest 13 souls, including all 7 children of our settlement. A great evil has been purged, but at terrible cost. The ground where the witch's blood soaked the earth must never be built upon, for she promised to return and claim more innocent lives." A witch hunt, Amelia breathed. They executed someone they believed was a witch on that land. Her name was Esther Wainwright. Marian continued reading. She proclaimed her innocence until the end, cursing those who condemned her and promising to return every 25 years to claim 13 souls, the same number lost in 1798. And the dolls? Eleanor asked. Marian pointed to the final paragraph. The witch used children's dolls for her unholy rituals, speaking through them to corrupt the innocent. All such items have been burned. The library lights flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness. When they returned, a small cloth doll sat on the table before them, though none of them had placed it there. She's accelerating her timeline, Amelia said quietly. We may not have until the 15th after all. By nightfall, the rain had intensified into a torrential downpour. The Bingham Inn stood silhouetted against flashes of lightning, its Victorian architecture taking on a menacing aspect. Inside, Thomas had gathered the remaining staff and guests in the dining room, 17 people in total, including Amelia, Zoe, and Eleanor. Due to the approaching storm and potential for flooding, we're offering full refunds to anyone who wishes to leave tonight, Thomas announced, maintaining a calm facade despite the supernatural threat he now understood they faced. Most guests opted to leave, packing hastily and braving the storm rather than spending another night in rooms where mirrors reflected things that weren't there, and whispers emerged from the walls. By 9 p.m., only 7 people remained in the inn. Thomas, Eleanor, Zoe, Amelia, an elderly couple named the Hendersons who couldn't drive at night, and a business traveler, Mr. Reed, who had deadlines that prevented his departure. 7, Amelia noted grimly as they regrouped in the kitchen. Hey, that's not enough. Not enough for what? Zoe asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Esther needs 13 souls to complete her revenge. The same number lost in 1798. Amelia spread out the historical documents they'd borrowed from Marion. In previous cycles, she never managed to claim all 13. In 1973, there was 1 death. In 1998, no deaths but 1 person permanently mentally damaged. Rebecca, Eleanor murmured. Each time the ritual was interrupted or incomplete. Amelia pointed to the pattern they'd discovered. But she's growing stronger. The manifestations are starting earlier and more intensely this cycle. Mr. Henderson appeared in the kitchen doorway, his weathered face pale. There's something wrong with Martha. She's speaking strangely. They rushed to the lobby where Mrs. Henderson sat rigid in an armchair, her eyes fixed on middle distance, her lips moving rapidly. The words emerging were distorted, spoken in reverse but growing clearer as they listened. She's coming through the floor. 13 stakes for 13 hearts. The children dig her path. Mrs. Henderson's voice had taken on a childlike quality, incongruous coming from the 75-year-old woman. Amelia knelt before her, recording the episode. "Mrs. Henderson, can you hear me?" The elderly woman's head rotated toward Amelia with unnatural smoothness. "Esther sees you, unbeliever." Esther remembers when they held her under the water to test her purity, when they drove stakes through her limbs to pin her to the earth. A crash from upstairs startled them. Thomas and Mr. Reed went to investigate, returning minutes later with disturbing news. "All the dolls are gone from room 305, Thomas reported. "And there's something on the floor." In room 305, the carpet had been torn away, revealing wide wooden floorboards. In the center of the room, the boards had been pried up, exposing dark soil beneath. The hole was small but unmistakably fresh. She's digging her way out, Amelia realized, using the dolls as conduits, controlling them to do her physical bidding. A scream from downstairs sent them rushing back to the lobby. Mr. Henderson stood frozen in horror, pointing at his wife. Martha Henderson sat motionless, her eyes now completely black, a small cloth doll clutched in her hand. As they watched, blood began to seep from her ears, nose, and eyes. "We need to evacuate now," Amelia ordered. "Get everyone out of the building." But as Thomas moved toward the front door, it slammed shut with tremendous force. Throughout the inn, windows closed and locked themselves. Paintings crashed to the floor, and the electricity failed, plunging them into darkness broken only by flashes of lightning. "The dolls are blocking the exits," Eleanor's voice came from the darkness, followed by the beam of her flashlight. The light revealed small figures stationed at every door and window, dolls of various sizes and materials, their painted eyes gleaming with malevolent purpose. "We're trapped," Zoe whispered. Just like she was. From upstairs came the sound of splintering wood, as if something was tearing its way through the very structure of the building. The grandfather clock in the lobby struck midnight, its deep tones echoing through the darkened inn. Mrs. Henderson had fallen unconscious, blood still seeping slowly from her eyes. Her husband refused to leave her side, dabbing at her face with a handkerchief that had long since been soaked through. Amelia had transformed the dining room into a command center, spreading out the historical documents across the large oak table. Flashlights and emergency candles provided minimal illumination as the storm continued to rage outside. "The pattern is consistent," she explained to the others. "Esther uses the dolls as vessels, then progresses to human hosts. Once she has control of enough vessels, she attempts to physically manifest." "And the digging?" Thomas asked, glancing nervously toward the ceiling, where the sounds of splintering wood had been replaced by a rhythmic scratching. "She was buried on this land," Amelia said. "Not just executed, but her body was staked to the ground to prevent her spirit from wandering. The historical accounts suggest they drove 13 stakes through her, symbolizing the 13 victims she was accused of, killing through witchcraft. So she needs 13 souls to free herself completely," Zoe concluded. "But there are only 7 of us." "She'll draw others here," Amelia warned. The storm, the dolls, they're all part of her influence, extending outward as if on cue. There was a pounding at the front door. Eleanor cautiously approached, peering through the peephole. "It's Marion from the library," she called, "and she's not alone." When they opened the door, they found the elderly librarian accompanied by 5 rain-soaked strangers, travelers whose vehicles had been disabled by the storm. The newcomers were disoriented and frightened, having been inexplicably drawn to the inn despite its darkened state. "We were heading to Boston," a woman in a drenched business suit explained, "but something called us here." 12, Amelia counted under her breath. She almost has enough. They brought the newcomers into the dining room, offering them towels and hot tea. Amelia quietly updated Thomas, Eleanor, and Zoe on the worsening situation. With Mrs. Henderson, under Esther's influence, and 12 potential victims. She only needs one more to complete her ritual, so we keep everyone safe until morning, Thomas said firmly. The historical records show her power wanes with daylight, but this is an accelerated cycle, Amelia reminded him. We can't assume the usual rules apply. From upstairs came a new sound, a soft, melodic humming that seemed to resonate through the walls themselves. Several of the newcomers tilted their heads as if listening to a distant call. "Block your ears," Amelia instructed, recognizing the danger. "She's trying to enthrall you." The travelers complied, though the businesswoman frowned. "I don't hear anything." Zoe, however, could hear it clearly, a haunting lullaby that seemed familiar somehow, as if from a half-forgotten childhood memory. The melody pulled at her, urging her toward the staircase. "Zoe!" Eleanor grabbed her arm as she took an unconscious step forward. "Stay with us." The humming intensified, and upstairs the scratching sounds grew louder. Plaster dust began to fall from the ceiling as something moved within the walls and floors of the inn. Mr. Reed suddenly stood, his expression blank. "She's calling. We should answer." Before anyone could stop him, he bolted from the dining room and up the stairs. Thomas and Amelia rushed after him, but it was too late. By the time they reached room 305, Mr. Reed had already torn more floorboards away, expanding the hole. He turned to them, his eyes black and empty. "The 13th has arrived," he said in a voice not his own. "The circle is complete." A blinding flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap that shook the foundations of the inn. When their vision cleared, Mr. Reed lay motionless on the floor, and standing in the center of the room was a figure that hadn't been there before, a woman in mud-caked colonial dress. Her hair wild and tangled, her skin bearing the marks of centuries buried in the earth. 13 stakes protruded from her body, through her limbs, torso, and neck, but she moved as if they caused her no pain. "Esther Wainwright," Amelia breathed. The apparition's head turned toward them, revealing a face both beautiful and terrible, eyes burning with centuries of rage. "You know my name, unbeliever," Esther spoke, her voice resonating with unnatural power. "Now you will know my vengeance." Chaos erupted throughout the Bingham Inn. The remaining dolls, now animated by an unseen force, attacked the guests in the dining room. The businesswoman screamed as a porcelain doll latched onto her face, its tiny hands clawing at her eyes. Marian Blackwood recited protective prayers from memory, creating a temporary barrier around herself and the Hendersons. Upstairs, Thomas and Amelia backed away from the manifested form of Esther Wainwright, who advanced toward them with unnatural, jerking movements, as if her body remembered centuries of immobility. "You built upon my grave," Esther hissed, "generation after generation defiling my resting place with your presence." "You were wrongfully executed," Amelia said, trying to reason with the entity. "The people who condemned you are long dead, but their blood lives on," Esther countered, her gaze fixing on Thomas. "Bingham, I taste your ancestors' righteousness in you. Minister Elijah led my persecution, did he not?" Thomas paled. "My family has owned this land for generations, yes. Then you shall be the first to pay the debt." Esther raised her hand, and one of the stakes in her body extracted itself with a sickening sound. It hovered in the air before launching toward Thomas like a spear. Amelia shoved him aside, the stake embedding itself in the doorframe where he had stood. "Run!" she shouted, pulling him into the hallway and slamming the door shut. The wood immediately began to splinter as Esther attacked it from the other side. Downstairs, Zoe and Eleanor fought a losing battle against the dolls. 2 of the travelers had already fallen unconscious, bleeding from multiple wounds inflicted by the small but vicious attackers. "We need to get everyone to the basement," Eleanor shouted over the cacophony of breaking glass and splintering wood. "It's the oldest part of the building, built directly into the bedrock. Maybe she'll have less power there." As they helped the injured down the narrow basement stairs, Zoe noticed the dolls seemed reluctant to follow, stopping at the threshold as if prohibited from entering. This observation gave her a flash of insight. The basement was here before the inn, she realized. Before the boarding house, before everything. It might have been part of the original settlement. Amelia and Thomas joined them, barricading the basement door behind them. In the dim light of their remaining flashlights, Amelia examined the stone walls with newfound interest. Zoe's right. This foundation predates the inn by decades, possibly dating back to the original settlement. She ran her hand over strange markings carved into the stone. These are protective symbols, not Christian, older, pagan warding signs. The historical records mentioned Esther practiced older rituals, Marian added, helping Mrs. Henderson to a seat on an old trunk. The settlers feared her because she maintained the old ways, a tremendous crash from upstairs signaled. Esther's continued rampage through the inn. Dust and small pieces of plaster rained down from the ceiling. "She's tearing the building apart to get to us," Thomas said grimly. "No," Amelia corrected, her flashlight beam tracking the dust fall. "She's searching for something. The record said 13 stakes were used to pin her to the ground. She's only removed one so far. The other stakes must still be buried on the property," Zoe suggested. "She needs them all to fully manifest her power." Amelia nodded. "And I think I know where they might be." She directed her light to the far corner of the basement, where the stone floor gave way to packed earth. The original execution site. As the group huddled in the relative safety of the basement, the storm outside reached its peak. The old inn groaned under the assault of wind and rain, its timbers creaking like the hull of a ship in high seas. Above them, Esther's fury manifested in violent bursts of supernatural energy that shook dust from the ceiling beams. "We can't just hide," Zoe said suddenly, her voice stronger than before. "She'll tear apart the entire building to get to us, and then she'll move on to the town." "What do you suggest?" Thomas asked. "We can't fight a spirit, but we can fight a witch," Marion interjected, her librarian's knowledge proving unexpectedly valuable. "The historical accounts say Esther was executed not just for witchcraft, but for attempting a ritual to bind the souls of 13 victims to extend her own life. A ritual that requires 13 stakes and 13 souls," Amelia added, the pieces falling into place. "The execution interrupted her ritual but didn't end it. For over 200 years. She's been trying to complete what she started, so we need to interrupt it again," Zoe concluded. Permanently this time, the basement had become their last refuge as Esther's power grew. Through the small ground-level windows they could see the storm had intensified to unnatural proportions, with lightning striking repeatedly at the same locations around the inn, forming a crude circle. "She's creating a boundary," Amelia explained, sketching quickly in her notebook, "containing us until she can claim all 13 souls." They had managed to revive the 2 injured travelers, but Mr. Reed and Mrs. Henderson remained unresponsive, their consciousness seemingly claimed by Esther's influence. The businesswoman, who had introduced herself as Dr. Jennifer Kraft, turned out to be a medical doctor and was tending to the wounded as best she could with limited supplies. "If we're going to stop this, we need to understand exactly what ritual Esther was attempting," Zoe insisted, her psychology training giving her a unique perspective on the unfolding horror. The historical documents mentioned 13 souls and 13 stakes, but what was the actual purpose? Marion, whose knowledge of local history was proving invaluable, closed her eyes in concentration. The journals mentioned a binding circle and anchors to the mortal realm. "I think Esther was trying to bind 13 souls to herself as anchors, allowing her to exist in both the spiritual and physical worlds simultaneously. Immortality," Amelia said. "Or something close to it. The stakes would have been the physical tethers," Thomas added, catching on, "each one connecting a soul to Esther and to the earth." A horrible realization dawned on Zoe. And when the townspeople executed her, they unknowingly used the same stakes for her punishment, completing part of her ritual. "They made her a martyr," Eleanor whispered, "giving her power even in death." The basement door suddenly splintered, the barricade they'd created bowing inward under tremendous pressure. Through the widening cracks they could see not Esther herself, but her proxies, Mr. Reed and Mrs. Henderson, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, their eyes black and empty. Behind them floated the dolls, dozens now, their painted faces twisted into unnatural expressions of hatred. "She can't enter herself," Amelia realized. "The wards on the basement are still holding, but she can send her vessels," Thomas said grimly. As the barricade gave way, Mr. Reed and Mrs. Henderson stumbled forward, their bodies moving with the awkward gait of puppets. In Mr. Reed's hand was a rusted iron stake, its surface caked with centuries-old soil. "She's found another one," Amelia warned. "That's 2 stakes recovered." Dr. Kraft stepped forward unexpectedly, brandishing a fire extinguisher she'd found in the basement. "Get back," she shouted, unleashing a cloud of chemicals at the possessed pair. They faltered momentarily, giving Thomas and one of the male travelers time to force the broken door closed again, wedging a metal shelf against it. "That won't hold for long," Thomas panted. Zoe's attention had been drawn to the earthen section of the basement floor. Kneeling, she began to dig with her bare hands, compelled by an instinct she couldn't explain. "Zoe, what are you doing?" Eleanor asked. "There's something here," Zoe muttered, her fingers breaking through the hard-packed surface. "I can feel it." Amelia joined her, using a broken piece of wood as an impromptu shovel. Several inches down, they struck something solid, a wooden box, its surface blackened with age. Together they pulled it from the earth. The box was sealed with wax and inscribed with symbols similar to those on the basement walls. As Zoe brushed dirt from the surface, a sense of recognition washed over her. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "In my dreams." The children in the woods wanted me to find this. Don't open it, Marian warned. It could be dangerous. But another crash against the door made their decision urgent. Whatever was in the box, it might be their only hope against Esther's growing power. Zoe broke the wax seal and lifted the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a small cloth doll, unlike the malevolent ones that had plagued the inn. This doll was clearly ancient, yet perfectly preserved, with features that seemed almost alive in the flashlight's beam. "It's Esther's journal," Marian breathed, examining the first page. "And her original familiar, the doll she used in her rituals before the accusations of witchcraft." Amelia carefully lifted the journal, its pages brittle with age. This could contain the key to reversing her ritual, as if in response to the discovery. The entire inn shuddered, and the pressure against the basement door ceased abruptly. An unnatural silence fell, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. "She knows we've found it," Thomas said, voicing what they all feared. "She's changing strategies." From somewhere above them came a child's voice, singing a haunting lullaby, the same melody Zoe had heard earlier. The song grew louder, joined by another voice, then another, until a chorus of children's voices filled the air with their eerie harmony. "The lost children of the settlement," Marian explained, her face pale. "The 7 who died in 1798, she's calling them to her aid." The temperature in the basement plummeted, their breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Frost began to form on the walls, creeping patterns that resembled tiny handprints. Zoe opened Esther's journal to its final entry, dated November 14th, 1798, the day before her execution. As she read the faded script aloud, the singing above them intensified. "They come for me at dawn. My circle remains incomplete. My anchors unsecured. But they cannot destroy what they do not understand. I have hidden my true heart where they will never find it, protected by innocence they falsely claim to defend. When the cycle of the moon brings the 25th year, I shall return. The children will help me. The 13 will be gathered. What was begun in blood shall be completed in vengeance." Dawn approached, though it was impossible to tell through the supernatural storm that still raged outside. The basement had become a war room of sorts, with Amelia and Zoe poring over Esther's journal while Thomas, Eleanor, and the others fortified their defenses as best they could. "The ritual requires 13 souls at the moment the stakes are removed from her body," Amelia explained, tracing the elaborate diagrams in the journal. "When the final stake is pulled, the souls are bound to her permanently, anchoring her to the physical world. But there's a vulnerability," Zoe added, pointing to a passage written in a cipher they'd managed to decode. "The ritual can be reversed if her true heart is returned to her body before the final stake is removed." "And what exactly is her true heart?" Thomas asked. Zoe held up the ancient doll they'd found in the box. It's not just a familiar or a focus for her power. According to the journal, Esther transferred a piece of her own soul into this doll for safekeeping. It's why she was able to persist after death. Part of her remained untouched by the execution. So we need to... What? Give the doll back to her ghost? Eleanor sounded skeptical. "We need to reunite it with her physical remains," Amelia clarified, "which should still be buried somewhere on the property." Marian, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "The rosebush. There's an old rosebush behind the inn that blooms every November, no matter the weather. Local legend says it marks an unmarked grave." The sound of children singing had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that pressed against their ears like a physical weight. The dolls no longer battered at their door, and the possessed Mr. Reed and Mrs. Henderson had disappeared. "She was gathering her strength for something bigger," Amelia warned. "We need to move now while we have a chance." They formulated a desperate plan. Thomas, Eleanor, and Marian would remain in the basement with the injured travelers, maintaining the protective circle Marian had created using symbols from Esther's journal. Zoe, Amelia, and Dr. Kraft would make their way to the rosebush, bringing Esther's doll, her true heart, to reunite with her remains. Armed with flashlights, makeshift weapons, and the ancient doll carefully wrapped in cloth, the 3 women ascended the basement stairs. The inn was unnaturally still, with no sign of the dolls or the possessed guests. Furniture lay overturned, windows shattered, but the destruction seemed frozen in time, as if the very air had solidified. They made their way through the ravaged lobby toward the rear exit. Outside, the storm had transformed the landscape. Lightning continued to strike in a perfect circle around the inn, creating a barrier of scorched earth. The rain fell unnaturally, avoiding certain areas while pouring in torrents over others, forming patterns on the ground that resembled arcane symbols. "The rose garden is there." Dr. Kraft pointed to a small fenced area about 50 yards from the building. Even through the storm, they could see a single rose bush, its blooms unnaturally vibrant against the gloom. As they stepped outside, the air thickened, making each movement an effort. The ground beneath their feet squelched, mud pulling at their shoes as if trying to hold them back. Halfway to the garden, Zoe felt a tug at her sleeve and turned to find a small child standing beside her, a girl of perhaps 6, wearing clothing from another century, her form translucent in the stormlight. "She won't let you reach it," the child said, her voice eerily clear despite the howling wind. "She's coming." "Who are you?" Zoe asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Sarah Williams. I died in 1798. We all did." The ghost child gestured around them, and Zoe realized they were surrounded by the spectral forms of children, their faces solemn and ancient despite their youthful appearances. "She didn't kill us. We were her students. She taught us the old ways, how to heal with plants and speak to the spirits of the land. Then why does she use you now?" Dr. Kraft demanded, clearly unnerved by the supernatural encounter. "Our deaths bound us to her," another child, a boy, explained. "When they killed her, our spirits had nowhere to go. We've been trapped here, just like her." Amelia, whose experience with the paranormal had prepared her for such encounters, addressed the spirits directly. "Can you help us free her? Free yourselves?" The children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Oh, we can create a distraction. But hurry, she's found 11 stakes already. When she pulls the 13th, it'll be too late." With that, the children's spirits scattered, their translucent forms racing back toward the inn, singing their haunting melody louder than before. From inside the building came a roar of rage that shook the remaining windows. "Now!" Amelia urged, and they sprinted toward the rose garden. The rosebush stood alone in the center of the small plot, its crimson blooms untouched by the storm. As they approached, the ground around it began to shift and bubble as if something beneath was stirring. "Dig!" Amelia ordered, dropping to her knees and clawing at the soil. The 3 women dug frantically, their hands soon muddied and bleeding from the effort. Several inches down, they struck something solid. Not the coffin they had expected, but a network of roots, thick as a human arm and pulsing with unnatural life. "These aren't rose roots, Doctor," Kraft observed, her medical knowledge recognizing the anomaly. "They're too symmetrical, too intentional." Zoe suddenly understood. It's her. The rosebush is Esther. The settlers didn't bury her body in a traditional grave. They quote, she couldn't finish the thought, the horror of it striking her mute. "They drove the stakes through her and into the ground, then planted the rosebush on top of her," Amelia completed grimly, "binding her to the earth itself." A blinding flash of lightning struck dangerously close, momentarily illuminating the garden. In that brief, terrible moment, they could see the true nature of the rosebush. Its trunk formed from a human spine. Its branches twisted human limbs. Its blooms nourished by blood that still flowed through a system more venous than botanical. "Quick, the doll," Amelia urged, unwrapping Esther's true heart from its protective cloth. As Zoe placed the ancient doll among the exposed roots, the entire property shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. The rosebush writhed, its branches reaching toward the doll with terrible purpose. From inside the inn came a scream of both rage and recognition, Esther sensing the return of her fragmented soul. The storm intensified to impossible levels. Lightning now striking continuously around them, the wind howling with the voices of centuries of torment. The ground split open beneath the rosebush, revealing glimpses of a human form fused with the plant's root system. 13 stakes visible at key points throughout the grotesque merger of woman and flora. "We need to remove the final 2 stakes," Amelia shouted over the storm. Complete the ritual her way, but with her true heart restored. Zoe reached into the opening, her hand closing around one of the ancient iron stakes. As she pulled, she felt resistance, not physical but spiritual, as if the stake tethered more than just flesh to earth. With a final effort, she wrenched it free, and one of the spectral children hovering nearby suddenly glowed with brilliant light, then vanished. "One more," Dr. Kraft yelled, reaching for the final stake. But before she could grasp it, a figure burst from the inn, Mr. Reed, still possessed, moving with inhuman speed despite his injuries. He tackled Dr. Kraft, his hands closing around her throat. Zoe lunged for the final stake as Amelia struggled to pull Mr. Reed away. Her fingers closed around the cold iron, slick with centuries of blood and soil. With a primal cry, she tore it from the earth. Light erupted from the open ground, blinding in its intensity. The rosebush twisted and transformed, human features emerging from its wooden form, eyes opening in the trunk, mouth forming from a split in the bark. The spectral children gathered around, their forms growing brighter as the connections binding them began to dissolve. Esther Wainwright's voice, no longer distorted by rage but clear and human, emerged from the transforming rosebush. "My heart returns. The circle closes." Not in vengeance, but in release. Mr. Reed collapsed, the possessing force fleeing his body. The storm abruptly ceased, the unnatural lightning fading, the rain returning to normal patterns. The dolls throughout the property fell lifeless, once again mere objects. As dawn finally broke over Bingham, the light revealed the rose garden transformed. Where the twisted rosebush had stood now grew 13 normal roses, their blooms white instead of blood red. The spectral children had vanished, their long imprisonment finally ended. In the basement of the Bingham Inn, Mrs. Henderson awakened, confused but unharmed, with no memory of her possession. The travelers who had been supernaturally drawn to the inn found their confusion lifting, replaced by vague explanations their minds created to make sense of the night's events. Zoe, Amelia, and Dr. Kraft returned to the inn, muddied and exhausted but successful. The cycle that had haunted Bingham for over 2 centuries had finally been broken, not through destruction or further vengeance, but through restoration and release. Thomas Peterson surveyed the damage to his beloved inn with a practical eye. "Insurance won't believe any of this," he said with grim humor. "Tell them it was the storm of the century," Amelia suggested. "That much, at least, is true." Eleanor found Zoe sitting alone on the front steps, watching the sunrise with weary eyes. "How did you know?" the older woman asked, settling beside her. "About the doll, about what needed to be done. You seemed connected to it all somehow." Zoe considered the question, understanding dawning as she reflected on the events. I think I was meant to be here. Not as a victim, but as the one who could end it. The dolls weren't threatening me. They were trying to guide me." In the distance, church bells rang, signaling the morning service in downtown Bingham. For the first time in 25-year cycles, November 15th would pass without incident, without whispers, without dolls moving in the shadows. "What happens now?" Eleanor wondered aloud. Zoe looked back at the Bingham Inn, its Victorian facade somehow lighter in the morning sun, as if a weight had been lifted from its very foundations. "We rebuild," she said simply, "and we remember not the horror but the truth. Esther wasn't a witch. She was a woman ahead of her time, persecuted out of fear and misunderstanding." As they sat in contemplative silence, a single white rose petal drifted on the breeze, landing gently between them. A final message, perhaps, or simply a natural conclusion to a long and natural cycle. Either way, the whispers had finally stopped, and the dolls of Bingham would trouble its residents no more.